Bearing in mind that this is the last year we have before Chag Shavuos, it is only natural that we deal with Inyana Diyayma. But before even starting today's year, I start with a tefillah. Let us hope, Eretz Yisrael niknei b'yisurim, and we are in difficult times. After a year of Corona, COVID-19, we had this horrific tragedy in Miran. And now we have these barbaric terror attacks and rockets raining down on our cities. Hashem Yerachem. As always, we see miracles. Hundreds of rockets and missiles falling on Orei Yisrael. And Baruch Hashem, up to this very moment, there wasn't even one casualty. Some people were hurt, but there wasn't even one casualty. Hashem Yerachem. So in the schus of tefillas, in the schus of Talmud Torah, and in times of trial and tribulation and nisyanis, we all need to daven and try to do chesed and just be better. So let us hope, and in this coming Shavuos, in this coming Yom Tov, we should be able to be sameach b'kol leivav. So today we will be discussing in Yonah D'Yoyma, and one of the interesting minhagim of Chag Shavuos is brought in the Ramah Tov Tzaddik Dalet Siv Gimel. Shoitchen asovin bebote knesios ubebatem zecher lesimchas matan Torah. Though this is primarily an Ashkenazi minhag, we put flowers and greenery in shuls and in homes. Zecher simchas matan Torah. But the Ramah doesn't explain how is this a zecher lesimchas matan Torah. In what way? When we examine the early sources, we find big differences in nuances, but very obvious differences in nuances. So the very first source is the Maharil. The Maharil was Avi Minhage Ashkenaz. And the Maharil Chag Shavuos, somewhat different than the Ramah, in 3 different points. The Ramah writes, Isvei besomim v'shoishanim, flowers and fragrances. He doesn't mention private homes, but in shuls. And instead of Zecher lesimchas matan Torah, he writes Simchas matan Torah. One of the earliest and most important sources of Minhage Ashkenaz is Sefer HaMinhagim Harav Isaac Tirnau, and he follows exactly in the footsteps of the Maharil. Besamim, Simcha, Beis HaKnesses, not private homes. Leket Yosha. He was also one of the earliest, a great disciple, a Talmud of Trumas Hadesh, on page 103. He doesn't mention shuls, only homes. Besamim. Number 4 is the Levush. He was a disciple of the Ramah. He follows in the footsteps of the Ramah. But the Knesses and private homes. Asovim, greenery. He doesn't speak about Besamim, but he explains. So how is grass a Zecher Simchas matan Torah? Because in the area of Har Sinai, there was a lot of grass. And that is how grass is a Zecher lesimchas matan Torah. That doesn't sound reasonable. Sinai is a desert. We don't know where Har Sinai is. The Arabs have a tradition, Jabal Musa, the mountain of Moshe. But that's an Arab tradition. We have no knowledge where Har Sinai is. But it's a desert. But the Ravush writes, if the Ponik says, V'gam atzoim v'abukar al yiru el mula harahu, mashma sheyasha mir'eh. They shouldn't graze. So what would they graze on? Sheep and cows don't eat rocks. They don't eat sand. So obviously, there was grass. And that is how Shoit Chamasovim is a Zecher lesimchas matan Torah. So these were fundamental minhagim of Chag Shavuos. And the Goen argued that if we examine the Goen, it is very clear he did not reject the minhag that I just mentioned from 5 different sources. what a Gaon rejected was source number 6, and that's the Mogen Avraham Tov Tzadik Dalet Siv Koten Hey. The Mogen Avraham brings another minhag, that we bring trees into the shul. And the reasoning for this minhag is a totally different one, not associated with Har Sinai. It is because Atzeres is Rosh Hashanah le'ilonos, so we should daven for Peres or Ilan, for an abundance of fruit, and that is why we bring trees into the shul. That is a minhag that the Mogen Avraham brings. And a Masarav minhag agra kuf tzadikei, the Gaon rejected the minhag quoted by the Mogen Avraham. The Chayodam was one of the Gaon's greatest admirers. Kuf lamed alef yud gimel and Chayodam afar Chaim, Peites and Chachmas Odam an Yoredeim. He quotes the Gaon argued, Bechukosem lo talech, we should reject this minhag. In the yeshiva world today, in the Litvish world, they don't have any of this. And their minhag is based on the Gaon, but I think that's a mistake. It is clear in these two early and important sources, Masarav and Chayodam, the Gaon did not reject the minhag that's brought in the Rishonim, the Maharil, the Ramah, Leket Yosha, Shtichas Asovim. He only was against the minhag of bringing trees into shul. And to me it's a pella. Ocha Shulchan Tov Tzadik Dalet Sivav. Ocha Shulchan writes, Achshov bitlu es aminhag shel asovim v'ilonos, v'gedol yisol yodu tam hadavar. So this sif is a big pella to me. Number one, why doesn't he quote the Gaon? He was in a Vardok. He was aware. He probably saw the Chayodam. So why doesn't he quote the Gaon? And why doesn't he write the reasoning? Gedolim yodu tam hadavar. And he puts together Ilonas and Asavim. In my opinion, they're not the same. Nobody disagrees with the minhag of Shtichas Asavim. So there is no reason why in the yeshiva world they shouldn't do it. I think the Gaon only rejected the other minhag that's brought in the Mogen Avraham, Ilonos. And why? Because that's minhag Goyim and Funkstein. What's Funkstein? Many mistakenly think that the Gaon and the Chayodam are referring to Christmas, and the Goyim have their trees in Christmas. Atzei Ashuach, I don't know how it's called, that species in English, but the truth is it has nothing to do with Christmas. Funkstein is Pentecost, and that is a Christian holiday that always coincides with Shavuos, more or less. And the Gaon says, this is Darkei Huamoiri, and it's an Isser. And therefore I think we should analyze the sugya of Darkei Huamoiri. So in Chazal, this prohibition, this Isser is found in two different expressions. Chukas HaGoyim, Darkei Huamoiri. They're one and the same. Just two different words, two different expressions. And the essence of this Isser is, we cannot follow in their ways, even things that are not Avodah Zorah. If it's Avodah Zorah, there's an Isser of Avodah Zorah. Avuz Rayud Avodah Zorah, that's Yerek Val Yavar. We're not dealing with minhag Avodah Zorah. But nevertheless, minhag HaGoyim. So that is sometimes called Darkei Huamoiri, and other times Chukas HaGoyim. Two different sources in Toras Moshe, from where we know the Isser of Darkei Huamoiri. Rashi, in Avodah Zorah Daf Yud Aleph, quotes the posuk in Parshas Mishpotim. Lo tishtacha ve'eloheim ve'lo te'ovdeim ve'lo ta'aseh k'maseihem ki hores ta'orseim ve'shaber matzav ha'yiseihem. Lo tishtacha ve'lo te'ovdeim clearly refers to Avodah Zorah. Lo ta'aseh k'maseihem, according to Rashi, that is Darkei Huamoiri, Chukas HaGoyim, even things that are not associated with Avodah Zorah. Rashi Shabbos Samach Zayin Amud Aleph quotes the posuk in Parshas Acharei Mois. Kemas Eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshaftem bo lo ta'asu, ukemas Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi eschem shamo lo ta'asu, uvechokoseihem lo teilechu. This posuk doesn't deal with Avodah Zorah, but rather entirely with Darkei Huamoiri. These are the two basic sources in Toras Moshe. in which we find it's an avera to follow in their ways, to adhere to their customs, and to perform their minhagim. What are the limits? What's asur? What's mutar? The Yereim, one of the great Bali Tosfos, Mitzvah Shin Chov Gimel, has a unique shitta. In his opinion, Darkei Amoyri is also only what we find in Chazal. Aleim ein lahoisef umehem ein legroa. We don't add any new things to that list. Darkei Amoyri is only what Chazal prohibited. But this opinion is a das yochid. All the other Rishonim and Poskim we find major discussions. What are the klolim? What are the protim? What's in? What's out? Velo kedivrei sefer hayereim. So what is in and what goes out? Avodah Zorah Yud Aleph Omid Aleph, we find the sugya sorfin ala malachim. The custom was in days of yore when a king died, when an emperor died, they used to make a bonfire and burn his garments, his personal items and belongings. And that was, on one hand, an expression of Kvoid Malchus. No one is fitting to use his personal belongings, and also an expression and a manifestation of sorrow and grief. And the Gemara says, obviously, this is not defined as Chukas HaGoyim. If it would be Chukas HaGoyim, then how could we do it? Tosfos wonders, by the Zorah Yud Aleph and also Sanhedrin Beis. This sugya contradicts the sugya in Sanhedrin. One of Dalad Mises based in is Saif, and there's a machlokes Yehuda v'Chachamim whether we actually do Saif because it's Darkei Amoyri Chukas HaGoyim, and the Gemara says, but Saif is in our Torah, and the Torah overrides Chukas HaGoyim. So why wouldn't we say the same by Sorfin al Malachim? The Gemara quotes the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Lamed Daled, Uba misrafois avoisecho hamelachim, we will burn your belongings. So Tosfos explains, Shnei dinim b'darkei amoyri. Anything associated with Avodah Zorah is totally banned, as I explained before. Minhag shtus, if we find a source in our Torah, then it is permissible, either Torah, Nevi'im, or Ksuvim. But if we don't find a source in Torah Seinu HaKdosha, then that is b'chukaseim lo telechu. The Ran in Avodah Zorah writes a big yesod, and it's a different approach. And the Ran writes, there are 3 dargis in b'chukaseim lo telechu. Once again, anything associated with Avodah Zorah is totally prohibited. Minhag shtus depends, but any minhag that is rational and sensible, and it has some practical benefit, would never be b'chlal b'chukoseim lo telechu. That is the opinion of the Ran. Tshuvas Marik Shoresh Peches follows in the footsteps of the Ran, and the Ramo follows in the footsteps of the Marik and the Ran. Kuf Ayin Ches in Yoredeya. And therefore the Ramo writes, doctors, nurses could wear a special uniform. Yes, it is something we learned from the Goyim, but it's sensible. There's reason to it, and therefore there would be no b'chukaseim lo telechu. So many different sectors in the modern world wear uniforms for various different reasons. Doctors and nurses. It's important when you come to the hospital to know to identify who's a doctor, who's a nurse. People come into your room, understand that they're coming to help you. If there is someone in distress, you know whom to turn to. I think there's another reason as well, because doctors and nurses need to have sterilized clothes. If everybody would bring his own suit, his own shirt, his own pants from home, how would you know that they're sterile? And therefore, yes, it makes sense. Policemen in the entire world have uniforms. I think that is also important. We need to know to identify the law keepers, the lawmen, and people that care for our safety, to know whom to turn to know to recognize. Soldiers wear uniforms. Once again, They should be able to identify each other in the field, and also wearing a uniform gives you some pride, gives you some sense of belonging. So the Ramon Damarik writes, that is not b'chukasem lo telechu, and any minhag that has reason and logic, makes sense, is not in b'chukasem lo telechu. Shabbos Samech Zayin. Kol davar sheyesh bo refuah, ein bo mishum darkei hamoiri. Probably based on the same yesod. If it's to your benefit and it'll help you, it is medicine. There is no darkei hamoiri. And the revusa is, even though it's not really practical medicine, it's not conventional medicine, it's not medicine that is accepted by science, it's a sgula. Nevertheless, you don't do it l'shem avodas zorah. You do it for your health. There is no darkei hamoiri. Machloikas rishonim, stiras harashba. Is there only refuah beduka, or maybe witchcraft? Even if it's not refuah beduka, if it's mishum refuah, ein bo darkei hamoiri. And this sugya is discussed at length in Yordei Semakufayin Tes, also in Shulchan Aruch Chaim. Shin Aleph, Sif Chav Zayin. So that is the opinion of the Ran. We find this by treating the ill, wearing uniforms, sorfen al hamalachim. Rabbi Yosef Shon Natanzon, the great Shoel HaMeishiv, in a Sefer Yosef Das Yordei Shimem Ches, uses the same reasoning to be miyasher min Yisrael and to reject the opinion of the Gra. When we bring trees into shul, it's not associated with worship, with das, with religion, with religious ritual. No, not at all. It's kvoid beis haknesses, and therefore there would be no chashash of chukos hagoyim. And the Shoel HaMeishiv writes, I turned to one of the primary Christian leaders in my community, and I asked him, why do you bring trees into your houses of worship in Pentecost? And he explained to me, it is not religious ceremony, it is to beautify the house, the sanctuary. And therefore the Shoel HaMeishiv paskins, that would not be a problem of chukos hagoyim based on the Ramah and the Marik and the Ran. The Masham Das Torah, Kuf Tzadik Daled Orach Chaim, follows in his footsteps. And the Masham quotes a tshuva in Rivash. Fascinating tshuva, Kuf Nun Ches. Let me give you a drop of history, because it's so important that Talmidei Chachamim know the background and know these great personalities and their lives. The Rivash was a Talmud of the Ran, going back more than 600 years. And at the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, the Rosh fled Spain. I think he was in Mallorca, crossed the Channel of Gibraltar, and arrived in northern Africa, Algiers, Morocco, and that is when Torah started to flourish in northern Africa. And the Rivash was asked about a minhag that many Jews adhere to. The entire Shivas Yemei Avedis in the Shiva, every day they go out to the caver of the deceased. And the Rivash was asked, this is something the Muslims do, and we took it from them. Is there a problem? And the Rivash says, it is not ritual, it's not worship, just about Kvod HaMeis, and therefore there is no problem of Darkei Hamoiri. So we quoted many sources, Vatzad HaShoveh Shebehem. If it's Mishum Kavod, if it makes sense, if it's reasonable, then there is no Darkei Hamoiri. Zichron Yehuda Menogam of Maramash Simakuf Nun Tes, we find Maramash had the same opinion. And he was the greatest disciple of the Chassam Sofer. I'm an anical of the Maramash. So is it my interest to say he was the greatest disciple? How could I know that? No other Gadol in the last few hundreds of years had so many Talmidim Moshe Gedolis or Rabbanei Keulos. Most of the Rabbanim in Hungary and many of those in Galicia, one generation after the Chassam Sofer were his disciples, His Talmidim. It's not something I say. Droshes Ksav Sofer, we have a hesped on Maramash, and the Ksav Sofer says, He was first and foremost the greatest of my father's Talmidim. The Maramash, Zichron Yehuda, his minhagim, did not agree with the Gra. So as we see, many Gedolim are miyashav the minhag found in Mogan Avram. It's kvoid beis Hashem. It's not ritual, and therefore we're not choishesh l'darkei Amoyri. Hamas Bekli of the Hashem is the Sefer of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam, and he was asked about making a crown of roses and flowers to put on the Sefer Torah. In many cases they do that up to this very day in Chag Shavuos. And the son of the Rambam writes a big yesod. We do it, the Goyim do it. Who started? If we learn from them, that's a problem. If they learn from us, then we just do our thing. And we don't care that the Goyim do the same. 170 years ago, the Jewish world was in a huge struggle. Gezeres halevush. In Russia and then in Poland, the authorities decreed that Jews could no longer wear their own special garb, and they need to dress just like the Goyim. And there were two different opinions in Klal Yisrael. The Goyim said, Yehereg val yaver, quoted by the Chayodam, Yordei Peites. Number one, it's B'chukasem lo telechu. Number two, Sha'as Gzeira. Gzeira Shmad Yehereg val yaver. The Chayodam was taken aback, and he says, I tried to convince the girl that he's too lechumra, but I didn't succeed. I wasn't successful. I wrote a kuntis on this topic, and I brought about 15 sources. But I'm just discussing it briefly. Chuvas Maramash, Yordes Menunhei. Maramash says, no, we do not need to go overboard. Your Mesiras Nefesh is not required. Number one, he says, it's not b'chukasem lo telechu. Because so many Jews already wear short garments. It's no longer considered minhag hagoyim, contrary to the Sefer Maspik Lo'evdei Hashem of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam. And he also writes, their objective is not to tear us away from Torah. Interesting, it was an ayin tova. Might very well be that the main goal and objective was to tear us away from our Torah. But Maramash says, all they want is to develop a feeling of brotherhood between all the different groups and citizens living together in this country. And therefore will not be defined as darkei Amoyri. Going back to the yesod we mentioned before, anything that has reasoning and sources, bekisvei HaKodesh as well. Some of the more common minhagim had a big hovering question mark. Kaporos. Tofrei Shei, Shulchan Aruch HaChaim. The Mechaber rejects the minhag, and he says we should stop this. And the Ramah says, minhag v'sikin. Yesoidoi b'hararei kodesh. Minhag Yisrael Torah. Chuvas Rashba, Aleph Shin Tzadikei, the Rashba writes, Darkei Amoyri, something we took from the Goyim. However, my opinion is, doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is here and now. Maybe it came from the Goyim. I know a lot of Goyim. I don't know one of them that does kaporas on a chicken, Erev Yom Kippur, or any other time. I just want to make an interesting comment. Most of the Christian holidays coincide with ours. And they copy it a lot from Torah Seinu Agdoisha, Lahavdil. Easter always falls, Pesach time, Pentecost, Shavuos time, Christmas, the beginning of the year, coinciding with Yomim Neroim, Lahavdil, Ben Kodesh L'choyim. None of them copied Yom Kippur. It is only Eden that feel the need for kibbutz and for tshuva. But anyway, coming back to our discussion. Minhagei hagoyim, if they became part of what we do, And these minhagim are brought in our Torah G'dosha, in Rishonim or Achronim. That is no longer b'chukei sayim lo telechu. So I know some goyim. I don't know anyone that does kaporas. Definitely Yat Yom Kippur. So it is no longer minhag goyim. At this stage, it's a minhag Yisrael. Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, Yoredei Kuf Nun Tes, is a letter to Maratz Chias. And the Maratz Chias asked the Chasam Sofer, what's the heter to shave your beard? It's minhag goyim. Fascinating tshuva from the Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer writes, why do you think it's minhag goyim? I dafka think we were the first ones to shave, and the goyim learned from us. So that wouldn't be darkei hamoiri. And even if it would be that we learned from them, still is not darkei hamoiri, because it doesn't matter where it came from. Today, it's no longer minhag goyim. And this is a svara we find in many different sources. Seems to be contrary to the Maspek Lo'ivdei Hashem. But this is a powerful svara. So regardless of where the minhag comes from in days of yore, if it's nishtarish bekerev Yisrael, it is no longer darkei hamoiri, unless it is associated with avodah zorah, and that has a totally different mashmois. So most of the free world, putting flowers on a caver is broadly accepted. Is that permissible? According to the sources we quoted today, and why not? It's not religious ritual, has nothing to do with worship. It is once again an expression of our love and our grief after our loved ones who passed away. Moran Harav Ovadia, Yabia Oima, Chelik Gimel Yoredei Semachov Dalad, has a huge tshuva. Every tshuva is a huge tshuva. And he quotes dozens of sources. I didn't count. Sometimes he quotes more than 100 sources. Lakan or Lakan, at the end of the tshuva, he writes, Yesh lehem al mashi yismochu, according to the Ramah. If a minhag is not a minhag shtus, it's not a minhag avodah zorah, it is sensibly sound, then wouldn't be b'chukei sayim lo telechu. However, Rav Ovadia writes, we should try to explain b'darkei noyim that it's not part of our tradition. It's not a minhag Yisrael, and we should stay away from doing it. I think there is special sensitivity when it comes to a beis kvoros or a shul. That is my feeling. So anything that has basic reasoning makes sense. It's not avodah zorah, it's not divrei hevel. There is no b'chukei sayim lo telechu. But that's the opinion of the Ramah, and the Gro disagrees. And Bir Gro Kufayin Ches, and the Gro says, the Gro follows the footsteps of Tosfos, while the Ramah and many other poskim go in the opinion of the Ran. Tosfos doesn't differentiate whether it's sensible or not, practical or not. So the Gro l'shitosoi, even if something makes sense, but if it's minhag goyim, we should reject it. And therefore he rejected the minhag of bringing trees into shul. Makes sense. Mogen Avraham says, she is parallel peres uilan. But the Gro l'shitosoi. And the Ramah l'shitosoi. That is why the Ramah brings the minhag of shoitchem asovim. However, at the beginning of Shir, I already explained that I don't think the Goan has a problem with asovim. I think his problem is only with ilonois, with bringing trees into shul, because that is directly what the goyim were doing. And this brings me to the very last nekuda. Thousands of people, especially Hasidim, but not only Hasidim, at this stage, Klal Yisrael loves gulas. And every day we have new gulas and new minhagim. But this is not a new minhag, and that's shlisel challah, making a challah in the shape of a key. It's gula leparnasa. And recently, I saw that someone wrote and published an entire essay, an article against this minhag, and he said it's taken from the pagans and it's not a Jewish minhag, and I totally reject that approach. I think when a minhag finds its way into the Sifrei HaKodesh of our Gedolim, it definitely can no longer be Darkei HaMoiri. Oyev Yisrael, one of the great disciples of the Noamer HaMelech, writes there are various different reasons on this minhag. So I think we should be very careful with our expressions. Minhag Yisrael Torah, Hanach lehem, im lo nevi'emem b'nei nevi'emem. And this is a minhag Yisrael. And just like I said about Kaporos, I know a lot of Goyim. I'm not aware that any of them makes a shlisel challah for Shabbos. So yes, this is a minhag Yisrael. Because it's not really important where this minhag comes from 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. What determines this halacha is the here and the now. So we started off the shir today with the minhag of Shavuos, Shoit Chamatzavim, and we touched many different sources, many different topics and subjects. So let me just share with you some thoughts on Yom Kabbalas HaTorah B'Oleinu L'Tova. The beginning of the Shia quoted the Maril, Shoit Chamatzavim, Mishum Simchas Matan Torah, Simchas HaRegel. How would that enhance our simcha? Well, sometimes what you see enhances your simcha. What you smell enhances your simcha. But why is this so important on Shavuos? I mentioned before, maybe because Shavuos doesn't have any specific mitzvahs. But I think Shavuos is more important than any other day to stress Simchas HaTorah and Simchas HaMitzvah in many different ways. If it's flowers, let it be flowers. Cheesecake, blinches. As we learn in Psachim Sameches Omud Beis. Many times I told this story, and I hope I'll tell it many more times. I once visited my great Rebbe, the Kloisenberg Rebbe in Union City, New Jersey. And he was very weak and feeble and ill. And as he walked in, he surprised me by asking a question, because usually he was the one that gave the answers, not the one that asked the questions. But he said, in Toras Hashem, in many different sources, Eretz Yisrael described Eretz Zavas Cholav Dvash, putting Cholav before Dvash. So why is it then in Shir Hashirim the pasuk says Dvash v'Cholav tachas l'shanech? Does Dvash come before Cholav or the other way around? I responded by saying Talmidechu anan v'memechu anu shoisim, as Chazal teaches us the beginning of Chagiga, and the Rebbe said, I want to hear what you have to say. And I said, yes, I have a thought. And this is what I said. When it comes to actual Cholav and Dvash, Shivcho Shel Eretz, of course Cholav becomes before Dvash. Without Cholav, this would be a barren world. First of all, it's hard to imagine humankind without Cholav. Ketina kayonik mishdayimoi. Without Dvash, we could get along perfectly. The biggest problem we would have is what to do with the apple, Leil Shenish or Rosh Hashanah. I trust that Gedolei Yisrael, with their creativity, would find a solution. But when we're dealing with Torah, Dvash comes before Cholav. It is only if we are successful in conveying the message of Simchas HaTorah to our children do we stand a fair chance that they will follow in our footsteps. So Dvash v'Cholav tachas l'shoinech is a reflection of Simchas HaTorah. And Simchas HaTorah is so important, so central, so fundamental, that I just can't abstain from talking about Simchas HaTorah when we approach Shavuos. Dvash v'cholav tachas l'shoinech. As I explained, in Torah we need to put the dvash before the cholav. Dvash indicates the mesikas of Torah. Psukim dvash v'noifes sufim. Cholav indicates Omar Torah, Yagiyas Torah. Brocha samach gimel amid beis. Maidach siv ki mitz cholav yoytzechemo. B'mi ata motzechemo shel Torah b'mi shemeki oleo cholav sheyonek mishdei yemoy. And that is the highest level of Omar and Yagiyah. It is only if we are successful in conveying to our children Simchas HaTorah and Simchas HaMitzvah that we stand a chance that our children would want to follow in our footsteps. And that is why it is so important to put the Dvash before the Cholav, Shashua before Simchas HaTorah. So as I said at the beginning of this year, these are difficult days and difficult times. From one Nisoyan to the other. So let us open the schus of Talmud Torah and the tefillas of Revavos Amchu Beis Yisrael and the merit of all those that are moving to Yisrael in these most difficult times. We should be zoicha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yerachem Aleinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send us Mashiach Tzedkeinu. We should be zoicha to Binyan Beis HaMikdash b'mheiro v'yomeinu. Amen.